The world watched Bobbi Kristina Brown grow up before she could even speak. By 9 months old, she was already in a music video. By 2, strangers were studying her face. By 12, cameras were inside her family's living room. But behind the smiles and the famous last name, something darker was always unfolding. A young girl shaped by chaos, a teenager surrounded by people who saw her as a paycheck, and a story her family kept buried for years. Now, after all this time, what we always suspected has finally been confirmed. And it's worse than anyone thought. Bobbi Kristina Brown came into the world carrying a name that already meant fame, power, and public fascination. She was born by C-section on March 4, 1993, in Livingston, New Jersey, only 8 months after Whitney Houston and Bobbi Brown had entered a marriage that was already drawing intense attention. Her father was one of the biggest names in New Jack Swing, and his 1988 hit, My Prerogative, had helped define an era. Her mother was Whitney Houston, a voice so massive that the world rarely spoke about her in ordinary terms. So from the very beginning, Bobbi Kristina was never treated like a child who would simply grow up and choose her own pace. People looked at her and saw a future symbol, a future heiress, a future extension of the Houston name. Since she was Whitney's only child, there was nobody beside her to divide that pressure. Every expectation landed on one small pair of shoulders. Her introduction to the public happened almost before she could understand what attention meant. At only 9 months old, she appeared at the end of her parents' Something in Common music video in December 1993. A few months later, in February 1994, she was in Whitney's arms on the American Music Awards stage, while her mother accepted a record-breaking 8 awards in one night. That moment said a great deal without anyone needing to explain it. Bobbi Kristina was not being raised near fame. She was being raised inside it. By the time most children are only beginning to be known to family and neighbors, she had already been seen by millions. As she grew, the public kept studying her in a way that can distort childhood. By her 2nd birthday, people were already discussing her features and comparing them directly to Bobbi Brown. They talked about attitude, expression, resemblance, presence. Adults who had never met her felt comfortable turning her face into a conversation topic. That kind of attention can seem harmless from a distance, yet it quietly teaches a child that even her looks belong to public opinion. For Bobbi Kristina, that lesson came early, and it stayed. Her childhood did not move along the usual path of school, private family time, and a protected home life. Tours were part of her normal world. She traveled with Whitney and watched crowds fill arenas for songs that had become part of global culture. She stood near stages, backstage corridors, dressing rooms, flashing cameras, and long nights built around music and performance. She joined Whitney at major events, including the Sopot Festival in 1999 and a Good Morning America outdoor concert years later. In those moments, she was not only the daughter of a superstar, she was also a visible part of the image that surrounded Whitney Houston. Audiences were watching the child of a legend grow up in front of them, and that constant watching began to shape the way people thought about her future. Even school could not fully pull her out of that spotlight. Paparazzi waited outside the family home. Cameras hovered around family appearances. Interviews, awards, shows, red carpets, and public events created a world where privacy never had strong walls. Childhood for her was not built around disappearing into ordinary days. It was built around always being somehow visible. That matters, because children learn who they are partly by being unseen long enough to figure themselves out. Bobbi Kristina did not get much of that room. Long before she was old enough to control her own image, television had already started telling the world who she was supposed to be. By the time she appeared in Being Bobbi Brown in 2005, she was around 12 years old, and viewers were encouraged to see her through the most obvious lens possible. She was Whitney Houston's daughter. She was Bobbi Brown's daughter. She was the next generation of a famous family that seemed brilliant from the outside and unstable underneath. The show aired from June to September 2005, and it did not present a carefully protected family life. It showed a household filled with strain, strange humor, tense energy, and behavior that made many viewers uneasy. Conversations seemed slurred. Arguments rose and fell. Moments that should have remained private were edited into entertainment. For Bobbi Kristina, this meant that a deeply personal stage of life unfolded before a television audience. She was not appearing as a fictional character. She was a real child moving through real confusion in a home that tabloids were already describing as troubled. There were tense car rides, raised voices, sudden mood changes, and the kind of unpredictable atmosphere that can make a child alert all the time. Even when she stood quietly in the background, she was still part of the scene. She was absorbing the tone of the room, the emotional weather of the house, and the knowledge that millions of strangers were watching. That environment shaped how the public understood her, and over time it also shaped how she seemed to understand herself. Many celebrity children grow up around controlled images designed to protect them. Bobbi Kristina grew up in a house where the line between family life and public content had become thin. Reality television turned private strain into something viewers discussed week after week. It made vulnerability look like programming. It made a child's home feel open to commentary. Once that happens, the damage can linger because the person at the center no longer owns the full story of her own life. Yet even in that environment, signs of her ambitions began to emerge. One of the moments people remembered from Being Bobbi Brown was when she sang, "I'm Your Baby Tonight," on camera. That was not a casual moment for any child, and it was especially loaded for her. She was stepping toward a Whitney Houston song, toward a voice the world treated as almost untouchable, and doing it while still very young. Every note carried the weight of comparison. Every attempt carried the question that always followed her. Could Whitney's daughter sing? Could Whitney's daughter become a star? Could Whitney's daughter carry the name forward? That moment mattered because it moved her from the background toward the center. Viewers were no longer only seeing the child near famous parents. They were seeing a girl who seemed to want something for herself. Even if she was still finding her way, the wish was there. She wanted to perform. She wanted to be seen as capable. She wanted to step into a future that had clearly been circling around her since birth. The truth is that her connection to performance had been developing long before the reality show. At 1 year old, she had already charmed an audience at the 1994 American Music Awards while in her mother's arms. By 1998, her voice could be heard at the close of Whitney's "My Love Is Your Love," giving her a small but meaningful place inside one of her mother's major musical moments. Through the late 1990s and early 2000s, she often joined Whitney at tour stops and public appearances. Sometimes she ran on stage. Sometimes she stood near the center of attention. Over time, audiences began to see her not simply as Whitney's child, but as someone growing toward the spotlight herself. That image built slowly, then firmly. It settled into the public mind and stayed there. By the time The Houstons on Our Own arrived in 2012, reality television no longer looked like a new chapter in her life. It looked like an extension of a pattern that had been following her since infancy. Cameras had been there for the cute moments, the glamorous moments, the tense moments, and the painful ones. So when the world saw her again after Whitney's death, it did not feel like a sudden opening. It felt like a continuation of a life that had rarely belonged only to her. Whitney Houston died on February 11, 2012, and everything around Bobbi Kristina changed at once. Grief entered the center of her life, and with it came a new kind of attention. She was still very young. She had just turned 19 on March 4, 2012. Yet, in the public imagination, she was already being placed into a much larger role. She was Whitney's only child. She was the sole heir. She was now expected to represent memory, family, brand, legacy, and emotion all at once. A teenager was suddenly being watched as if she should know how to carry an empire while still trying to survive loss. Her most widely remembered interview from that period aired on March 11, 2012, less than a month after Whitney's death, on Oprah's Next Chapter. The special also included other family members, yet Bobbi Kristina's solo segment became the emotional center of the entire event. The audience was not simply watching an interview. They were watching a grieving daughter try to speak while the world leaned in, hungry for meaning, comfort, and perhaps some sign of what would happen next. She was still living in the Atlanta area home tied so closely to her mother's final chapter. She was still in the raw first weeks of grief. Nothing about that moment was distant or settled. It was immediate and exposed. During the interview, Bobbi Kristina spoke about feeling Whitney's presence around her. She described lights flickering and doors moving at moments when she was thinking about her mother or crying. She said she could hear Whitney's voice urging her to keep moving and keep going. In that conversation, these details did not come across as horror or spectacle. They felt like the language of a daughter trying to make sense of loss, when loss is too fresh to explain plainly. Grief often reaches for signs. It looks for comfort in moments that might otherwise seem ordinary. For Bobbi Kristina, these experiences became part of how she kept her mother close in the early weeks after that devastating rupture. She also used that interview to protect Whitney's image from years of crude public reduction. The world had spent a long time focusing on scandal, addiction rumors, and chaos. Bobbi Kristina wanted people to know another version of Whitney, the version she had lived with. She described her mother as her best friend, her confidant, and the person who meant everything to her. She talked about ordinary tenderness, shared time, private rituals, and the quiet side of Whitney that the public rarely saw. In those words, there was both love and urgency. She seemed to know that once a person becomes a legend, others rush to simplify them. Bobbi Kristina wanted to hold on to the fuller truth of who her mother had been at home. At the same time, she made clear that she had plans for herself. She spoke about wanting to carry on Whitney's legacy through singing, acting, and dancing. That phrase, "carry on the legacy," quickly became one of the defining lines associated with her. It was replayed often because it expressed both ambition and burden. She was not saying she wanted a quiet life beyond the reach of fame. She was saying she wanted to step into the world that had shaped her from childhood. She wanted to build something, perform, and continue a line that the public already believed belonged to her. There was courage in that. There was also heartbreak in it, because the pressure inside that dream was enormous. She was not just another 19-year-old talking about creative plans. She was Whitney Houston's only child speaking publicly, less than a month after losing her mother. The audience did not hear those ambitions in a vacuum. They heard them against the silence left behind by one of the greatest singers in modern music. Every hope she voiced immediately became larger than it should have been for someone her age. Even so, she moved toward work. In 2012, She made her acting debut on Tyler Perry's For Better or Worse, playing a receptionist named Tina. This was not framed as a one-moment novelty. It was a real role in an established television series, and that gave the opportunity weight. She was stepping into scripted performance, into a set where she had to function as part of a cast rather than as a grieving public figure. The role suggested movement, discipline, and the possibility of a career that might grow if given time and stability. For observers, it looked like the beginning of something that could belong to her, even though the Whitney Houston connection would always remain part of the conversation. Later that year, she also appeared in the reality series The Houstons on Our Own, which followed the family after Whitney's death. The show ran for 14 episodes and placed Bobbi Kristina close to the center. This time, viewers were not watching her as a child in the background of family turmoil. They were watching a young woman in grief, navigating love, family conflict, public scrutiny, and her own plans for the future. The lens stayed close. Her pain stayed visible. Her relationship with Nick Gordon drew attention. Her efforts to keep moving forward unfolded in front of an audience that had already decided she symbolized the continuation of a famous legacy. That same year, she also stepped onto one of the biggest public stages available to her. On May 20, 2012, at the Billboard Music Awards in Las Vegas, she accepted the posthumous Millennium Award on Whitney's behalf. It was one of the first major award show appearances she made without her mother beside her. The symbolism of that moment was powerful. She stood there as daughter, mourner, and representative of someone whose voice had shaped millions of lives. She called herself blessed to have been in such an incredible woman's life. The words were simple, yet the moment behind them was heavy. A young woman was speaking for a legend, while still trying to find footing in the wake of loss. Looking back from that point, her public path between 2005 and 2012 had already formed a clear arc. At 12, she was on Being Bobbi Brown, exposed to the world as part of a troubled but famous household. In later years, she continued appearing with Whitney, including on programs such as The Oprah Winfrey Show, and her own interest in performance kept surfacing. By 2012, she had reality television credits, high-profile interviews, red carpet appearances, a major family docuseries, an acting role, and repeated public statements about music, acting, and dance. All of it made one thing clear: she was not drifting near the spotlight by accident. She had been moving toward it for years. Still, her story remained complicated because none of those professional steps existed apart from the emotional conditions around them. Bobbi Kristina had grown up in a house where fame mixed with tension, where private life often became public material, and where love and instability could exist in the same room. Then she lost her mother while still in her teens, so every public appearance after Whitney's death carried two layers at once. There was the image of a young woman beginning her own path, and there was the reality of a daughter moving through grief under constant observation. The two were always together. One never fully released the other. That is part of what made her presence so affecting to the public. People were drawn to her because she seemed both close to greatness and painfully fragile. She had access to legendary history, yet she also seemed trapped by it. She wanted to sing, act, dance, and create. She wanted to carry something forward. She wanted to prove she was more than a tragedy waiting to happen. At the same time, the world often looked at her through inherited sadness, inherited fame, inherited damage, and inherited expectation. Those forces gathered around her long before she had the power to push them away. Her life, therefore, unfolded in a strange tension. She was raised to be seen, but not given much shelter from what being seen can do. She was introduced to the public early, yet never fully allowed to become ordinary before people began imagining her future. She tried to step into performance on her own terms, yet every step was measured against Whitney Houston. She spoke with tenderness about her mother and with determination about her own plans. Yet even those moments were consumed through the appetite of mass attention. Underneath all of it was a young woman who seemed to want what many young people want. She wanted love, purpose, recognition, and a sense that her life could become something truly hers. That is why Bobbi Kristina Brown's story stays with people. It is not only the story of a celebrity daughter, it is the story of someone who entered a world already prepared to define her, then spent years trying to breathe inside that definition while also reaching beyond it. From her birth in 1993, through the camera-filled years of childhood, through the reality television era, through the grief that followed Whitney's death, and through the early efforts to build a career, her life moved in a line that felt both public and heartbreakingly personal. Every stage connected to the next. The child in the music video became the girl on stage. The girl on stage became the tween on reality television. The tween on reality television became the grieving young woman on Oprah. The grieving young woman then tried to become an actress, a singer, a keeper of legacy, and perhaps simply herself. Nick Gordon did not enter Bobbi Kristina Brown's life as some new outsider. He had been around for years. Around 2007, when he was about 17 and Bobbi Kristina was roughly 14, Whitney Houston informally took him into her Atlanta area home. From that point on, he lived under the same roof as Whitney and her daughter, and in public, he was often described as a godson or someone like a brother. That image stayed in place for a long time, which is why the change that came later felt so jarring to so many people. After Whitney Houston died in February 2012, that relationship began to look very different. Within months, tabloid photos and reality show footage showed Nick and Bobbi Kristina holding hands and kissing. A person the public had known as a long-time family presence was now being presented as her boyfriend. In October 2012, they confirmed on the Houstons' On Our Own that they were romantically involved, and by 2013, Bobbi Kristina was publicly calling Nick her fiancé. Then, in January 2014, the two posted messages online claiming they had married, and Bobbi Kristina even referred to Nick as her husband in interviews, which gave the story of a secret wedding even more force. Still, the legal record told a different story. When the wrongful death case later pulled their private claims into public scrutiny, lawyers for Bobbi Kristina's estate said that a full search of Fulton County and nearby jurisdictions found no marriage license at all. In other words, there was no legal marriage on record. That point became very important because the title Nick used in public carried emotional weight, but in court, it carried no legal standing. As more details came out, the relationship looked darker than the image they had shown online. In June 2015, while Bobbi Kristina was still alive but in a coma, her court-appointed conservator filed a civil complaint in Fulton County. The suit accused Nick Gordon of taking money from her bank account without permission and moving those funds to himself. It also claimed that he presented himself as her husband in order to control her finances and cut her off from family. Even more disturbing, the complaint accused him of domestic violence and said he had brutally beaten her on multiple occasions, including knocking out teeth. That changed the public story in a serious way. What had once been framed as a strange romance now looked, through legal filings, like a relationship shaped by control, alleged abuse, and financial manipulation. At the same time, both the Brown family and the Houston family publicly rejected the idea that Nick and Bobbi Kristina were husband and wife. After Bobbi Kristina was hospitalized in early 2015, Attorney Christopher Brown, speaking for Bobbi Brown, said clearly that she was not and had never been married to Nick Gordon. People close to the Houston side said the same thing. That public denial mattered because it removed the image Nick had been building in interviews and online, and it also weakened any claim he might try to make over medical decisions or her estate. The tragedy at the center of all this had already begun to echo an earlier one. Whitney Houston died on February 11, 2012, at age 48, after she was found face down in a bathtub in Suite 434 at the Beverly Hilton, just hours before Clive Davis's pre-Grammy party. Her death was ruled an accidental drowning, with coronary heart disease and chronic cocaine use listed as contributing factors. Toxicology also found cocaine and several prescription drugs in her system. The shock hit Bobbi Kristina almost at once. The very next morning, on February 12, 2012, an ambulance took her from the same hotel to Cedars-Sinai Hospital, where she was treated for stress and anxiety after collapsing and reportedly crying out to see her mother's body. That loss did not happen in isolation. According to Pat Houston, Whitney's sister-in-law and longtime manager, the warning signs had been there for years. She later said the handwriting had been on the wall long before 2012, describing Whitney's drug use and unstable behavior through the 2000s. That means Bobbi Kristina did not simply witness one shocking event. She had been living inside her mother's decline long before the final moment arrived. In public appearances after Whitney's death, including a March 2012 Oprah Winfrey Network special, and later the Houstons. On our own, Bobbi Kristina tried to speak with strength and insisted that her mother was always with her. Even so, her voice shook, her eyes looked strained, and her weight loss was hard to miss. Beneath the tribute and the television cameras, she seemed to be carrying grief, pressure, and the burden of being treated as Whitney's legacy while she was still only a teenager trying to survive an impossible loss. Then came the haunting turn that made the story even harder to process. On January 31, 2015, almost 3 years after Whitney's death, Bobbi Kristina Brown was found face down and unresponsive in a bathtub at her townhouse in Roswell, Georgia, just outside Atlanta. She was 21 years old. The home was one she shared with Nick Gordon, the man she publicly called her husband, which made the scene feel painfully familiar from the very first reports. Police described it as a drowning incident, and officials said Gordon and a friend pulled her from the tub before emergency crews arrived. By the time paramedics reached her, she had no pulse and was not breathing. Doctors were able to resuscitate her, but the damage was severe. She was first taken to North Fulton Hospital and then placed in a medically induced coma as doctors tried to manage swelling in her brain. Soon after, she was transferred to Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, where she remained on a ventilator and never regained consciousness. During February and March of 2015, the family released short and careful statements saying she was fighting for her life and asking for prayers, but very little was said publicly about her real condition. Behind those brief updates, the outlook was becoming more painful with each passing week as meaningful neurological recovery failed to appear. By June 2015, specialists had concluded that the brain damage was irreversible. On June 24th, she was moved to Peachtree Christian Hospice in Duluth, near Atlanta. That move made it clear that the focus had shifted from trying to save her life to making her comfortable. A month later, on July 26, 2015, Bobbi Kristina Brown died at age 22. She had spent nearly 6 months in a coma or unresponsive state and never woke up after the incident in the bathtub. The timing only deepened the horror of it all, because her death came almost exactly 3 years and 5 months after Whitney Houston's death on February 11, 2012. When the autopsy and toxicology reports were unsealed in March 2016, the details added another layer of unease. Tests found marijuana, alcohol, a cocaine-related substance, morphine, and medications used for sedation or anxiety in her system. Officials said they could not determine whether the morphine came from heroin because heroin breaks down into morphine in the body. Her official cause of death was listed as lobar pneumonia, caused by hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, which is brain damage from lack of oxygen, along with immersion of the face in water and mixed drug intoxication. The pneumonia developed during the long period of life support, but investigators made clear that the chain of events began with the bathtub immersion and the substances in her system. Even with all of that, the medical examiner did not classify the manner of death as accident, suicide, or homicide. It was ruled undetermined. Officials said plainly that her death was not from natural causes, but they could not say with certainty whether the bathtub submersion and drug intoxication were caused by deliberate harm, self-harm, or an accidental overdose. That unresolved finding kept suspicion alive for years, especially because the civil lawsuit against Nick Gordon had already accused him of assaulting her, giving her a toxic cocktail, and placing her unconscious body in the tub. No criminal charges were filed, so the full truth of what happened in that bathroom on January 31st, 2015, remained officially unresolved. Even so, the civil case moved ahead after her death. In Georgia, Bobbi Kristina's estate continued the wrongful death lawsuit against Nick Gordon, and this part of the story ended with a powerful legal judgment. Gordon repeatedly failed to appear for hearings and missed important deadlines during the case. Because of that, Fulton County Superior Court Judge T. Jackson Bedford Jr. entered a default judgment against him in September 2016, ruling him legally responsible for Bobbi Kristina's wrongful death. Then, in November 2016, after a hearing focused on damages, the court ordered Gordon to pay about $36.25 million. That total included $15 million tied to loss of life and future earning potential, $13 million for pain and suffering, and additional punitive damages. That ruling did not amount to a criminal conviction, and there was always real doubt about whether that money could ever be collected. Still, the judgment remains one of the clearest legal conclusions in the case. It matters because it cut through years of rumor, gossip, and distorted internet retellings. Bobbi Kristina never came out later to explain anything herself. She was unconscious for nearly 6 months before she died, so the official record was built from court filings, family statements, testimony, and medical findings. In the end, what remains is not some dramatic confession or late twist pulled from online clips. What remains is older, colder, and much more official. A young woman who lost her mother in one of the most shocking celebrity deaths of her time, then followed a deeply troubling path of grief and dependency into her own fatal collapse, and a civil court that ultimately held Nick Gordon legally responsible for her wrongful death.